Nancey, do humans need souls?
No, they don't. Human beings are not composites of a body and some other sort of substance. They're what I like to call spirited bodies. And by that I mean we are physical organisms just like the rest of the animals. What makes us distinctive is our exceptionally large brain, the way it's organized. That gives us the capacity for language and, in consequence, reasoning and cultural development. Those are a lot of the capacities that the soul was once employed to explain. Other purposes for which we thought we needed a soul was to be in relationship with God and for eternal life. To be in relationship with God, all we need is for God to be in relationship with us. For eternal life, for hope for eternal life at least, what we need is to believe in the fact that Jesus was resurrected bodily. And so it's bodily resurrection that the Christian tradition looks forward to.
Some would argue that for God to communicate with human beings, you need a soul to be this intermediary substance of some kind.
Oh, I hear that argument so often, but it simply leaves out of account that God created the whole physical world. And God has been able to relate to that whole physical world ever since its beginning.
Well, the argument that God needs a soul actually doesn't seem to make that much sense, because then the soul itself has to communicate with the brain. So God could communicate with the brain, I guess, just as easily as a soul could.
Exactly. You've answered your own question better than I did.
Well, it's your inspiration that makes me do it.
I'll turn you into a theologian yet.
The question, though, if I think about the need for human consciousness and self-awareness, that I think would be a requirement for God to communicate with human beings. And if we look at evolutionary history and what seems to be a gradual development of a more human way of thinking, the question comes up, it's maybe a little bit of an annoying one, is when did this happen? Was it a gradual phasing in of consciousness to which God gradually communicated, or was it like a critical mass and God waited for it to get to a certain point, and as soon as it did, bam, there it is, and now I can start communicating? Can we even make efforts to progress on this?
Well, I certainly believe that God has been involved with the human species, the previous hominid species all along, insofar as they were capable of being related to. But for God to be able to reveal himself to the human species, we have to be able to have a concept, something like the concept of God, however primitive that would be. That requires language. And so certainly God could not genuinely be revealed to hominids prior to the development of language. And in fact, it would have to be fairly sophisticated language in order to have that sort of abstract concept. And so I believe that God waited patiently until humans had developed the intellectual capacities to form concepts that would be at least rough, rudimentary versions of our later concepts of divinities or deities, and then, only then, began to attempt to communicate. And probably, as humans have done ever since, nobody got it right at the beginning, nobody got it at all at the beginning, but God was patient and kept trying, and gradually humans came to appreciate that there was something transcendent, something other, something divine.
I'm not sure humans get it all right even now.
You're right.
But again, would God have had some very rudimentary communication at early stages and some of the primitive religions, animism or whatever? Or do we think that's artificial, independent of God? It had to get to a certain point before God, the real God, began communicating?
I think one of the reasons so many people read the Jewish and Christian scriptures badly is that they assume that the characters represented way back at the beginning of the story had just as sophisticated an idea of God as we all do now. But actually, I don't believe that was the case. I think we've got in that 400-year history just a little bit of the tail end of a long development of a concept of God. And I think it's very valuable to look at what we pejoratively call the primitive religions now and use those as a model of how God might have begun communicating with the earliest humans at the very beginning, and then try to imagine how those early communications and early thought processes gradually have come forward to the sorts of religions that we recognize today.
Well, one is always arrogantly assuming that whatever era you're in is the era of final perfection in some way. But if we take what you say and assume there's been progress from animism to today in terms of God's ability to communicate and the capacity of humans to then respond and understand, one might be able to take the same argument into the future and say that at some point in the future, the communication between God and humans would even be better than it is today. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that's the case. And being a Christian, I believe that God did have a perfect communication partner in Jesus. But for the rest of us, I think we'll only know that perfect communication in the next life. And I think we will find that our understanding of God was incredibly primitive at this point. But my faith is that we haven't been seriously misled. It's just that what we've been able to understand up to this point has been incredibly primitive.
Well, I was hoping I didn't have to wait to the next life and you were going to help me out in this life.
I've told you everything I know.